Hi guys, it's Dr. Curry, and today we're going to talk about culture. Culture is one of those words that you've probably heard your entire life, but never really stopped to reflect on what it is. So today we're going to examine culture. Culture is identified or defined as a system of learned and shared symbols, language, values, and norms that distinguish one group of people from another. Now, it's important to note that each of us identifies with one or more groups that have a common culture that is comprised of language, of value systems, belief, traditions, and customs. So if we think back to our Introduction to Communication lecture, we see where how we even define communication is now brought into our definition of culture. That, again, you see this system of learned and shared symbols, of language, and you remember that that's an important part of what communication is. So we can see right offhand that communication is a very important and significant component of culture, and that's why we study it, one of the many reasons why we study it. Also important to note here that we can identify with multiple cultures. So the fact that we're taking this class together here in the United States means that we all identify in some form as belonging to American culture. Now, maybe you were born in another country. Maybe you were born in Canada or France or Mexico, Vietnam, just any other country. You also are going to identify culturally with the country that you were probably born in. We call that nationality. Nationality is something that we'll talk about here in a moment. So we can belong to multiple groups, multiple cultures at one time. Not just on a nationality level. Maybe you identify as Hispanic American, or more specifically Mexican American, which is a subset of Hispanic American. So you can see where it could get complicated in terms of how we define it, but that's really not important in terms of how we define ourselves within cultures and systems, but rather some of the more important factors that we're going to look at in today's lecture. So to get us started, an easy way to look at this is to talk about Texas. When you think about Texas, your view of Texas in terms of what Texas is going to be probably predominantly defined by whether or not you were born here. Now, I'll preface this by saying that I wasn't born in Texas. I was born in Tennessee, and Tennessee is actually nicknamed the Volunteer State. And we're nicknamed the Volunteer State because in 1846, Texas wasn't even a state. It was land that had been settled or claimed by America from Mexico, and Mexico didn't like that, and they wanted their land back. They wanted Texas back. Right? It wasn't America at that point, and so the Mexican army marched on Texas to try to reclaim that land. Well, the United States Secretary of War sent out a call for volunteers to come defend Texas. There was a saying they needed that help. And so they asked for like 2,500 soldiers from each state. Well, Tennessee sent over 30,000 soldiers. We sent more soldiers than all of the other states in the United States sent combined. And that's why we're called the Volunteer State. So every now and then I have this random argument with a Texas fan, someone from Texas, about who the real UT is, because I went to the University of Tennessee and our logos are very similar. So you know what? If it weren't for Tennessee, there'd be no Texas. All right, now that we got that out of the way, what are some of the things that you think of when you think of Texas? Texas as a state. When I moved here from upstate New York, and I'd also spent some time in Wisconsin, and all of my friends was like, wow, you're moving to Texas? Isn't there just a lot of cowboys and people with guns in Texas? So again, your view of Texas is going to be shaped by whether or not you're from here. Ironically, my first week here, I went to the Woodlands Mall, and while I was there, before I could even get out of the car, a cop on a horse came through the parking lot. And there was this moment where I was like, oh my gosh, maybe Texas, maybe there are just horses everywhere and people just ride horses through the city. So interesting perspective from being not being from here. Some other things that we think of when we think of Texas. Take a moment. You can stop. You can pause this lecture and or Houston specifically. Look at this, and what do you see? Well, it's something that stands out here. This is downtown Houston. Do you see that Be Someone bridge right there? This is a quintessential, this is a classic part of Houston's culture. What makes Houston, Houston, right? That Be Someone bridge. That's an important part of our Houston's culture. Whataburger. I also learned pretty quickly that people here, boy, they don't like it when you talk about Whataburger. Now, I give it Whataburger. They've got a good hamburger. It has grown on me. When I first moved here, I'll be honest, I really didn't like Whataburger. But now I love it. I eat Whataburger like twice, maybe 3 times a week. So it has definitely become part of my lifestyle here. But Whataburger, definitely part of Houston's culture, and Texas more specifically. Houston Rodeo. This was one of the things that people told me originally when I moved here. They're like, you've got to go to the rodeo. They're like, have you been to the rodeo? And I'm like, no, I've been here a week. So I learned that Houston rodeo scene was an important part of Houston's culture. I think they call these swingers or pokes. I had never seen wheels or rims on a car like this until I was in Houston, and I was driving down I want to say it was I-10. I've been here one day, and I saw a car with these wheels, and I was like, oh my gosh, what is that? I take my phone out. I'm trying to take pictures while driving. I've never seen this anywhere else in the world except here in Houston. Maybe it exists, but this is definitely part of Houston's culture. We also have the space program. I mean, Houston is called the Space City for a reason. Did you know that every American astronaut to ever fly in space was trained here in Houston? Yep, they were. Very cool. Houston also has a very vibrant art scene. We're known for murals, things like that, which is really cool. I've seen that in some other cities, but Houston is known for the murals. There's actually a mural map of the things you need to see in terms of murals in Houston. So all of those are some things that we think of when we think of Houston's culture, and maybe there's some others that you know. If there's a really cool one that you can think of that maybe we didn't talk about when we talked about Houston, send me an email, send me a message, and let me know, and I'll add that in. Now, as we talk about culture, I want to say that culture isn't a property of countries, our ethnicities, our economic classes. Rather, it's a property of people. Let me say that again. Culture isn't a property of countries or places, our ethnicities, our economic classes. Rather, it's a property of people. And what we mean by that is that while Houston has a culture, while Texas has a culture, while there is a even geographic culture, right? We say, I grew up in Tennessee, as I mentioned, so Tennessee and Texas are both geographically located in the South. They have a lot of things in common when you think of Southern culture, right? So we have Houston culture. We can even break it down even into subgroups from that. Say you have the Montrose area of Houston, which a lot of art, things like that in Montrose. So you have Montrose, and then you have Houston, and then you have Texas, and then you have the Southeast United States, then you have the United States, then you have North America, and then you have the world. So you can see how you can examine culture at a micro level and then just expand out to these larger subsets, which is really cool and an interesting aspect of culture. But culture, remember, isn't a property of those things. Rather, it's a property of people. So if you take everyone out of the city of Houston and you move them to Madison, Wisconsin, where I spent a few years teaching at the University of Wisconsin, and you take those people from Wisconsin and move them to Houston, is Houston still Houston? Is Madison, Wisconsin still Madison, Wisconsin? Geographically, yeah, right? The physical locations of those cities hasn't moved, But if you move all of the people out of Houston, then Houston really is no longer Houston, because culture isn't about the place. It's about the people who inhabit that place. So remember that. Culture is about people. And that's going to be important for our conversation today. The easiest way to think about culture is to think about it as a flower with all of these petals. So culture isn't just one thing. In fact, we have belief systems, we have language, different languages, customs, rituals, beliefs, behaviors, how we act towards each other, how we act towards other people in terms of like family, friends, things like that. Views on faith and religion, food. Food is a huge one. We could have an entire lecture talking about the differences in food based off of culture. That's one of the things I love about Houston, is that food-wise, you can get food from every culture in the world. It's incredible. Art, drama, music, attitudes, etc., etc. All of these are components that comprise culture. And so let's look at a few of these in more detail. So actually, let's go back. I want to give you a better example of this. So for instance, customs and rituals. So these are things that you take part in. So for instance, I had heard of the Day of the Dead before I moved to Houston, before I moved to Texas, but I really didn't know what it was about. I really didn't know the meaning behind it, the cultural richness behind it, until I moved here and asked people, and people started to tell me about it. And so I always just thought it was like similar to Halloween. Well, it's nothing like Halloween, right? It's this celebration. If it's part of your culture, then you know that the Day of the Dead is about the celebration of the life of people who've passed before you, and that you I've had students and people tell me that, you know, they'll go and they'll visit their loved one who had passed away on that day, and they'll take a cigar because their grandfather loved to smoke cigars, and they'll light a cigar and they'll place it there. Or maybe they'll take alcohol or their favorite food dish, something that celebrates that person, that memory and that life of that person. And that's really cool, and that wasn't really something that I had a lot of knowledge about. So we can think of other rituals. If we stay within Hispanic culture, and we can look at things like Three Kings Day. Again, that was a holiday that I really had never heard of growing up in Tennessee. Christmas. Christmas is a holiday, right? Christmas is a holiday that's celebrated culturally within specific religions or faith-based communities. So we have all of these different customs and things that we can look at. We could look at attitudes and beliefs. So things like child rearing practices, how you raise your kid or kids, attitudes towards women, beliefs about power, things like that. Those are all culturally rooted. We'll look at a few of those in a little bit more detail. All right, so moving along. We've talked about culture. We've defined it a bit. How do we get it? How do we acquire our sense of culture? Well, that process is called enculturation. And there's a few ways. One is ethnicity. And ethnicity is our perception of ancestry or heritage. And then we have so where you're from, where your family is from in terms of ancestry or heritage. Nationality we talked about in the very beginning. That's the citizenship. So if you're a citizen of the United States, if you're a citizen of another country, we gain some sense of culture through our understanding of nationality, where we were born, where we're a citizen, where we currently live, where we reside. There's a sense of culture that comes from that. And an interesting component here is that culture is taught to us as babies. We're not born with culture, right? We may be born in a specific country or specific location, but we're not born with culture. We're born into culture, and then we're taught what culture is by the people around us, our parents, our grandparents, our community leaders, things like that. So we have direct instructions. So the textbook gives a really good example of your parents have probably taught you to say thank you when someone does something nice for you, when they give you something? Our response is thank you. Well, that's direct instruction. That's someone teaching us that our value, our belief system, our custom, our cultural understanding and expectation is when someone does something nice for you, you say thank you. Right? That's direct instruction. We also practice and learn culture through imitation. So again, the textbook gives an example that says, no one probably ever taught you that when you get in an elevator, you face forward and you don't say anything. No one probably ever told you that. You probably didn't have that conversation with your parents. But you learned that practice through imitation. You learned it through seeing it, and then you imitate it. And then it become ingrained in your behavior system to where now you just get in an elevator and you look forward and you push the button and you go up to your floor and you get off. Sometimes even subconsciously we acquire culture, and we can do this through practices, behaviors, accents. When I was in Wisconsin, I was there for a few years, I started to pull my eyes, so it wasn't Wisconsin, it was Wisconsin. Also, people in Wisconsin would pull their O's. There would be a long O, so I would be in a drive-thru and I would be like, yeah, could I get a number 1 with a Coke? And I remember being on the phone with my mom and she was like, why the hell are you saying Coke? And I'm like, I don't know. It just happened over time. And so that's a subconscious acquisition of culture, enculturation. Really cool. So again, remember that culture is not innate. You're not born with culture. It's learned. Your language is taught to you. Your traditions are taught to you. Art is taught to you. Norms, behaviors, values, belief systems, all of those cultural artifacts are taught to you. You're not born with those. Which tells us that our culture, our views of culture changes over time, but it also tells us that it's very difficult for us to change our culture. Anytime something is taught to us, means it's deeply ingrained into us. It's a deeply rooted part of our identity, of how we see ourselves and how we see the world around us. And that makes it incredibly difficult to change. And we'll talk about how that can be problematic here in a bit. So with culture, we also have what's called in-group and out-group. And when we talk about hard to change belief systems, this is one area where we see that. So we have in-group and we have out-group. And in-group is a group to whom we identify. So like, these are my people, right? Out-group is going to be those people over there. People that we see as different from ourselves. And we're going to talk about ethnocentrism and why it matters here in a second. But our tendency is to, we call this birds of a feather. And birds of a feather, also part of uncertainty reduction theory, says that we tend to identify or stick with people that we view as being part of our group. And we do this subconsciously. So, for instance, if you've ever had a first day of class, or maybe a first day on a new job, you walk in and you look around and you look to see who's there. And chances are you've approached and sit down with people who you perceive to be closest to you. Let me say that again. You go in, you look around, and you choose, probably subconsciously. You're not making an active choice. Okay, let me look for another white dude. Oh, let me go sit with him. Let me look for another Hispanic woman. Oh, let me go sit with her. We don't do it consciously. It happens subconsciously. And so we call that birds of a feather. We tend to look for people who we perceive, again, perception is key there, perceive to be similar to ourselves. And then we seek those people out because it makes us more comfortable. We call that uncertainty reduction. You also see here culture shock. Culture shock is stress that occurs when we find ourselves in unfamiliar situations. This sometimes has a negative connotation, and it really shouldn't, because culture shock isn't negative. It just means that all of a sudden you're exposed to something that's different from yourself, And even if you've sought out birds of a feather, people who look like you, maybe the environment is just so different from what you're used to that it creates stress for you. When I was 17 years old, I'd never been out, really out of the southeastern United States. I had the opportunity to go overseas. We went to France, Spain, Morocco, Africa, on a school group in high school. And I experienced culture shock. All of a sudden, I was in not in Tennessee, I was in a different country with people who spoke a different language, a language that I didn't understand. Things looked different. Just the process of ordering food from a restaurant and not being able to speak the language, those things create culture shock for us. So again, it's not a negative thing. It's just stress that occurs to us when we find ourselves in unfamiliar situations. So it's an interesting concept, and I want you to stop and think about that next time you have a new class, or you have a new job, or you're in a new environment. Who do you seek out? And you're going to think back to this lecture and you go like, oh man, Dr. Curry was right. So one of the negative attributes, however, of in-group, out-group, seeking people who we perceive to be like ourselves, is ethnocentrism. And ethnocentrism is this idea that people exhibit a strong preference for other people that they perceive to be like themselves. And not only do they prefer people who are like them, but they are more suspicious and less trusting of other people whose ethnic, national, and or cultural backgrounds are different from their own. That's the problem, is that not that we just seek out people who are like us, but it's the idea that we look at other people and we say, you know what? No, my way of seeing the world, my cultural beliefs, my cultural values, my cultural norms, my cultural language is preferred, is better. That's the problem with ethnocentrism. The textbook talks about it and says, that when we come across people who have different values and systems, belief systems than ourselves, our natural tendency is probably to think of the other person as being wrong. But instead of approaching people from that perspective and from an ethnocentric perspective and saying, you know what, you're wrong. Your culture is inferior to my culture. That we need to practice mindfulness. And mindfulness is when we are able to acknowledge that, my position is informed by my cultural values. But guess what? Yours is too. Your position is informed by your cultural values. So my cultural values and beliefs are no more important than yours. We're just approaching the world from two different perspectives. And we need to be able to hear each other out and to learn and hear about other people's perspectives and experiences, because theirs are just as important as yours. And we can hold different values without condemning each other as being wrong. Again, I'll say that again. We can hold different values, different belief systems, different cultural perspectives without condemning someone else's cultural views, beliefs, religious practices, perspectives, etc. And the world would be a hell of a lot better place if we practiced more mindfulness. And that's really the focus of this week's lectures, between the TED Talk videos, the reflections that I'm going to having you do, as well as our course conversations and dialogue explorations are really centered around examining our own belief systems, our cultural practices, and then expanding those as well. Just a few facts. When we talk about the world is not our perspective or centered on our perspective. So you'll see here a Chinese flag and the number 29. And these are important because, again, ethnocentrism says that we tend to think of our position as being the best. But Americans don't actually comprise that much of the world's population. The most populous nationality on Earth is Chinese. almost 20% of the world's population, 1/5, identify as Chinese. That's an incredible statistic. The average age of someone on Earth, 29 years old. So the average person is 29. The average age is 29 years old. That's pretty cool when you think about that. Also, here's a statistic that you've probably not seen before. The percentage of the Earth's population that does not have access to internet. Okay. The percentage of the world's population, of the Earth's population, that does not have access to the internet. 55%. That's a mind-blowing number. 55%, over half of the world's population, does not have access to the internet. So you're privileged automatically. You're taking an online class. You're watching this lecture, so you have access to the internet, which is, when we think about it, that's an incredible position of privilege when over half the world doesn't even have access to the internet. This one shocked me. The average person in the world lives on less than $2 a day. Say that again. The average person, or the average person in the world, lives on less than $2 a day. Can you imagine living on $2 a day here in Houston, here in Texas? Crazy statistic. So again, from a socioeconomic position and conversation, we are definitely privileged in comparison to most of the world. We'll talk about privilege here in a second. So there is that cultural stereotyping. Stereotyping is when we assume people of certain groups to be a certain way. And that's what a stereotype is. You see someone and they are part of that other group, that othering, right? They're not a part of your in-group. They're part of that out-group. And you stereotype them. This is a cartoon that I ran across when I was doing this lecture. And I thought it was particularly impactful. You can read it. So I want to talk a little bit about privilege now. And privilege is something that the textbook really doesn't talk a lot about directly, but I will add that this lecture, I went back and I redid this lecture. So I've always had what I call Diversity Week in my classes since I've been teaching 8 years ago. In fact, I do diversity research. So if you've read into my background or biography, or maybe you've had me in other classes, or you're at University's Park campus, I'm known for diversity research. There's a lot of things that I do around campus centered around diversity. So this is a topic that's been important to me, but given the current climate of 2020, I decided I'd go back and I would redo this lecture and I would add a component about privilege in. In fact, there's a new assignment that you have in your weekly module where I ask you to directly think about privilege in your own life, how you benefit from privilege, how you're under-benefited from privilege, and then what that means as we talk about communication and improving our own life. So privilege is really this idea that there are social advantages and benefits that are degrees of respect that an individual has just because we belong to a certain identity or cultural group. So, for instance, I identify as a white male. Historically, that is a position, especially in the United States, that has had dominance over other people. Doesn't make it right, doesn't make it wrong. I'm just talking historically from a cultural perspective. White men have been in the position of power. And so when we talk about privilege, that is something that I have to acknowledge. I have to acknowledge that the fact that I'm a white male, that I have benefited, I have received advantages in my life because I belong to that group culturally in the United States. Now, I don't know what it feels like to be to not be a part of that group, and I'll talk about why that's important here in a moment. But that's racial privilege. There are a lot of other forms of privilege also. So privilege with gender identity, with education, with access to education, gender, sexuality, abilities, religion, socioeconomic class, etc. Those are just a few of the types of privilege. I've asked you in your reflection to think about those and some others. So I know you're going to examine these and reflect on these in your own life. So, for instance, with sexuality, if you identify as a white, male, heterosexual, Christian, and wealthy, that's like the upper echelon of privilege in the United States of America. If you identify as being heterosexual, that means you've never experienced life through the lens or the perspective of someone who identifies as being LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer. So because of that, you have a position of privilege when it comes to your sexuality. It's still legal to be fired for being gay in many states. The Supreme Court in 2020 ruled that you can't be fired for sexuality, but there's still some loopholes to that. So that was a huge advance in terms of equality this year, since my old lecture had been being replaced by this one. So I will acknowledge that. But still, if you have friends who identify as LGBTQ, ask them, say, hey, what are some of the negative experiences that you have? Maybe they've had difficulty at work or at school, or maybe they have family members who are unaccepting of who they are. And so they've dealt with those experiences. So if you identify as being heterosexual, then you have experienced privilege with your sexuality. If you identify as being white, Caucasian, you have experienced privilege your entire life without thinking about it based off of your race. If you are a man, you have experienced privilege based off of your gender. There's pay gaps, there's gender inequality, there's inequality in all of these things. If you don't have any physical disabilities or things that you would identify as being disabilities, then you have privilege when it comes to those things. You've never experienced or under-benefited from those things by having a disability that people then use against you in terms of hiring practices or stereotypes, etc. So I want you to think about these things. So again, you'll see that privilege is the benefits and advantages held by a group in power. And a key note here, while you cannot get rid of your privilege, we can acknowledge it. And so when we force privilege into view and we talk about it, then we can engage in solidarity with those around us who don't share in those certain privileges. And we shouldn't be afraid to talk about it. We shouldn't be afraid to have conversations about privilege. So again, I redid this lecture because this is a conversation that we need to be having right now, and that we are having right now in the year 2020 in the wake of the death of George Floyd, even more recently the events in Kenosha, Wisconsin, which was an area that I've been to, having lived in Wisconsin. So we need to be able to have conversations about race and about privilege and about equality and about moving this country forward in terms of racial equality and racial privilege. Here's a different way of looking at this. Our identity is comprised of these things: race, sexuality, ability, age, gender, culture, language, class, etc. We have privilege over benefit or under benefit from privilege in all of these things, in all of these multiple ways. Privilege is usually invisible to the person who has it until it's pointed out to them or after they have lost that privilege. So again, if you've benefited from privilege in one of those areas or categories, you've probably never really thought about it because you're benefiting from privilege. You have the benefit, the luxury of that of that privilege. And it's not until you lose something that, or someone else points it out to you, that you benefit from that, that you really stop to think about it. So as you do your reflections, there's a privilege checklist there that you can work through. But I saw this and I really thought this was a really good way to end the conversation on privilege for today's lecture. So becoming aware of privilege, that shouldn't be something that produces a burden on you. And you really shouldn't feel guilty about that. A lot of the conversations I've had with folks, people get defensive almost when they say, you know what, well, yeah, I'm a white dude. Yeah, I've had privilege, but what do you want me to do about it? Why are you like, they feel guilty, or they feel like they're being attacked because of ethnicity or race, a group that they belong to that they've never really thought about. And that's really the point. Discussing privilege, especially racial privilege, is going to make people uncomfortable. But we need to be able to have that conversation. We need to be able to acknowledge that racial privilege exists. Now, it doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't make me a bad person to say, you know what? I have benefited from racial privilege. I'm a white dude. I grew up in the South, in Tennessee. I benefited from racial privilege in ways that I never had to think about. I never had to have a conversation with my parents about getting pulled over by the police and what I should do in those instances. I never had to stop and think about certain things because I was part of a group that benefited from that privilege. And again, it doesn't make you a bad person to come from one of those groups. We have to be able to have those conversations and acknowledge the fact that your race, your sexuality, your abilities, etc., that we have privilege in those areas. We're in this thing called life, and we're all in it together. So the sooner we start to act like that, well, my personal belief is that the world will be a much better place when we do. I know personally, I'll be the first to admit, I have a PhD, all these other degrees in communication, but there's so much that I still need to learn from the experiences of other people in ways that I've never had to personally deal with. And I want to learn those things. We have to hold each other accountable and ask ourselves, how have I benefited from privilege? And more importantly, how can I help other people now? Other people who feel like they are not benefiting from those same guarantees, those same rights, those same privileges. How can I help them? What kind of world do you want to leave behind for your kids? What kind of world do you want to leave behind in general? So think about those things as you work through your reflection. Because if we do that, as this says, we can view it as an opportunity to learn and be responsible so that we can work towards a more just and inclusive world. I've assigned a TED Talk called The Muslim on the Airplane by Kassir. She does a fantastic job. That video is a few years old now, several years old in fact. But it seems like every year that goes by, it becomes more and more relevant. So watch that video, and then you're going to have some conversations in your assignments that guide that. So again, I wanted to talk about that, add that in, redid this lecture just so we could have that conversation about privilege, because it's important. It's especially important. It was important before 2020, but now there's a renewed focus on having that conversation, and we need to be willing to do that. So as we move forward to end out today's lecture, we're going to talk about a few things that the textbook identifies in terms of culture. And we're going to go through these pretty quickly. Individualism and collectivism. And these are types of cultures, and we generally identify these with nationalities. So especially individualistic culture, this is an I mentality. So in these types of cultures, the primarily responsibility is to oneself. So the United States is a perfect example of an individualistic culture, right? You were probably raised hearing messages like, be yourself, you're special, there's no one else like you in the world. right? That's individualistic messaging. Those messages emphasize the importance of being you, of being yourself, your own identity, self-sufficient and true to who you are and what you want in your own life. Now, we also value the idea of self-reliance, that we can, quote, pull ourselves up from our bootstraps. That's actually a quintessential American cultural statement right there, that in the United States of America, you can be anything that you want to be, and you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps. If you work hard enough, you can get to wherever you want to be. That's a quintessential American ideal. Now, we'll talk about a little bit later about why that may not always be true. But you see that with U.S., Canada, Great Britain, Australia, etc. Individualistic cultures. Collectivistic cultures, instead of having an I mentality, those cultures have a we mentality. So if you're a part of a collectivistic culture, your primary responsibility is to your family, to your community, to your employers. It's not about what can I do to benefit myself. It's about what can I do to help my family? What can I do to help my community? So there's high value in these cultures that's placed on duty and loyalty. So you may see yourself not as being unique or special, but as rather being a part of this larger group to which you belong. In these types of cultures, material possessions aren't really sought after. So it's not about buying a fancy car or a nice house for yourself. It's about buying a house for your family, or using your money to enrich the life of your collective family and not yourself. Some examples of these types of cultures: Korea, Japan, and a lot of Latin American and African countries are collectivistic cultures. So what effect does this have on the communication process? So one, in individualistic cultures, they experience conflict. When they experience conflict, they tend to express it directly, and they work on resolving it. So again, in the United States, you are taught, again, remember, culture is something you are taught, right? We learn this through being directly taught, through modeling, through imitation, through observation. So we learn these things. You're taught that when you have conflict, when you're upset with someone, we talk about it. You can come to me and say, you know what, Rick, I'm upset. I'm upset that you did this and it made me feel a certain way. We're taught that it is okay to express conflict, and that it is okay to talk about that and resolve that. But in collectivist cultures, they're taught to handle disagreements much less directly. So the goal there, and it makes sense if you think back to collectivist cultures, is about providing for your family and your community. Well, you want to preserve that social harmony. You don't want the community to be upset. You don't want to upset the balance of your family. So maybe instead of confronting the person, you just avoid the conflict entirely. You just don't talk about it. You don't address it. There are collectivist cultures that where people are taught that that's how you approach conflict. We also have high context and low context cultures. And in low context cultures, people are expected to say what they mean. We have this phrase in America that says, don't beat around the bush. Meaning, get to the point, express yourself, tell me your opinion. And we value trying to persuade other people. That's just part of a low context culture. Again, an example of that would be the United States. High context cultures, people are taught to speak less directly. So again, the focus is on harmony, not upsetting the balance, not upsetting people within the family or the community unit. So you want to avoid offending people. So instead of talking and expressing your true feeling, communication often in those settings occurs more via nonverbal communication. And nonverbal communication is a lecture that we'll have in the next few weeks. We'll have a whole lecture on it. We'll talk about that. In low power distance cultures like the U.S., we believe in the value of equality and that no one person or group should have excessive power. We believe that people may be born with more advantages. Like, sure, I would have loved to have been born into the Kardashian family, But I wasn't. So, yeah, the cool thing about it, though, is, you know what? I wasn't born into the Kardashian family. I work hard. I've put myself through school. I've advanced my own goals. But the Kardashians aren't any better than me. I'm no better than you. That's one of the great things about low power distance cultures is this idea that we're all equal, right? Now, there are some people who don't believe that. We talk about stereotypes and privilege and those things. We need to have those conversations. There are people who don't believe that. But overall, one of the quintessential American values is that we're all equal and that no one is better than anybody else. It's one of the things that uniquely that make us American, which is why other countries around the world have always aspired to be to that American ideal. Now, I've put a few asterisks here because, again, I think it's important to have this conversation. This doesn't mean that people in such cultures are treated equally, only that they value the idea that they should be. You could have a conversation with someone who believes complete opposite spectrum from you in terms of privilege on race, equality, sexuality, etc. And they'll say, yeah, well, I think everybody should be treated equally. Yeah, we should all have access to XYZ. But they value the idea of that, but everything else in terms of actions, beliefs, values, attitudes, etc. doesn't really speak to that. And so that's an important notation that I did want to make. We also see in high power distance cultures, power is distributed far less evenly. So there may be groups that have great power and the average citizen has much less power. In the U.S., we're a democracy, which means if you're age 18 or above, you have the right to vote. And whoever has the most votes, well, in a democracy, that person then governs. And that's how we elect our leadership and the people who create laws on the state and the national level in the U.S. There are cultures, high power distance cultures, where that doesn't happen, where the power belongs with the person in charge, and that person is in charge through different mechanisms, and they have far more power than anyone else. People in high power distance cultures are also taught that certain people or groups deserve to have more power than others, and that respecting power is more important than respecting equality. So in Saudi Arabia in 2015, women couldn't drive. They could vote, but they couldn't drive. Only recently have women been allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia. Again, in the U.S., that's something that most women would think of as being absurd because that's not part of our experience here, but that it is part of some high power distance cultures. So how does this have an effect on the communication process? So in low power distance cultures like the U.S., we expect our friendships and our romantic relationships to be based on things like love rather than social status. However, in high power distance cultures, they may not have that luxury. Culturally, the beliefs, the values, the system may be arranged where you are expected to pick your friends or your mates or the people, your partners or people in relationships where you don't pick those based off of people who are like you, people that you like to hang out with, or someone that you love. Rather, you pick them from within social class. Or maybe the relationship is prearranged for you, where you don't even get to pick who you want to be in a relationship with. So again, doesn't make that culture wrong. It doesn't make those values and beliefs wrong. It just means it's different from our own. Again, we want to avoid the ethnocentric point of view, which says, whoa, that's not what I experience. That's not what I've been taught. That's not what I believe. Therefore, you're wrong. Your culture's wrong. We need to approach that from a mindfulness perspective of our cultural values we hold very highly and believe that they're right. But if you were born and raised in a high power distance culture, chances are you're going to feel as strongly about your belief system as we feel about our belief system. And that's an important thing. We need to be mindful of that. in our view of others, and in our conversation with others. And lastly, we have monochronic and polychronic cultures, and this is just time, how we view time. Time is a commodity, and so in monochronic cultures like the United States, we view time as a commodity. We save time, we spend time, we value time, we invest time, and we waste time. We treat time as being valuable. We even have a phrase, time is money. If you have a 2 o'clock appointment somewhere, you show up at 1:50, 1:55. People are going, wow, you're really pushing it. And you don't show up late because it damages your reputation, because we value time. However, in polychronic cultures, time is viewed more holistically. It's fluid, it's less structured. Instead of treating time as something that is limited or a finite commodity, it is perceived as this never-ending resource. So schedules are fluid. When I was in Spain, I mentioned in high school, I've been to Spain since a few times, but our businesses shut down in the afternoon so people can take siestas, so they can take an afternoon nap. So time is fluid. I have friends who were raised in polychronic cultures, and I have Hispanic friends, and I'll say, well, we're going to have a get together at 7 o'clock, 7 p.m. And they show up at like 11 o'clock at night, like hours after the scheduled time. And they think nothing of it. They don't view it as being disrespectful, because they come from a polychronic culture where the value of time or perception of time is very different than this view that time is a commodity and time is money. There's some cool videos. I'll link to this. This is a video where the guy is talking. He's British, and he talks about what Britons think of America, and some things that really confuse them. And one of the things is soft drinks, and how our small soda in the U.S. is like a large soda over there. So you can watch some of those. Again, as you think about culture, remember that culture is a property of people, not places. And we are taught our cultural values. We are exposed to those. Remember last week we said, you are who you are today because of everything that has happened to you in your life up until this very point and moment in time. You are who you are because people have taught you, people have told you, people have shared with you their experiences and their beliefs and their values, and you have taken those and ingrained those into your own personal identities. We can expand our own communication by having conversations about the areas in which we are privileged in our own life. Not only areas in which we are privileged, but we can expand beyond that and practice mindfulness in our conversations with others and seek to hear out other people's perspectives and viewpoints on life. And again, remember that our way of doing things, our way of seeing the world is not right just because that's our belief system, because that's our culture. It just means that that's our perspective, and that other people have different perspectives from which they see the world. And we need to be able to stop and have those conversations. And as the TED Talk that you're going to review for your assignment will teach you, sometimes those conversations start with something as simple as, what's your name?